Difficulty no longer asks for permission. There is a point where difficulty stops feeling personal. It arrives on schedule. It stands where it always stands. It does not raise its voice. It waits. The body meets it with stiff fingers, cold air in the lungs, a dull ache in the legs. No drama follows. The room is quiet. Others glance, then look away, unsure why you did not hesitate. Most people believe hardship tests motivation. They brace for it, negotiate with it, search for the right mood before stepping forward. The result is predictable. The first resistance slows them. The second convinces them. The third ends the attempt. Not because the weight was too heavy, but because each encounter reopened the question of whether to continue. Watch the pattern closely. Shoes left untouched by the door. The alarm silenced with a dry mouth and heavy eyelids. Messages unanswered because the shoulders felt tight and the day already seemed crowded. Friends joke later about how life got busy. Laughter hides the retreat. The body remembers. There is another way this has been handled for centuries. Warriors and monks did not train to feel ready. They trained until readiness stopped being relevant. Knees folded onto the mat without ceremony. Hands wrapped the handle the same way. Breath counted itself when the mind resisted. The floor was cold, they knelt anyway. Others learned not to interrupt. Difficulty still arrived. It always does. But it no longer started a conversation. Before you continue, name the moment you usually negotiate with yourself. Write it down. No explanation. Just the moment, the person who always starts again. Let me tell you about someone like you. He sets the alarm early. The phone vibrates against the table. His eyes open to a gray ceiling, breath shallow, throat dry. For a moment his hand hovers. He sits up anyway. In the kitchen, the floor is cold under bare feet. The light flicks on. Outside, other windows stay dark. He notices. So do they. He is smart. He reads. He plans. He talks about systems over coffee while his shoulders stay tight and his jaw clenched. People nod. Someone says he's disciplined. He almost believes it. Then the routine breaks. Travel. Illness. A late night that leaves heavy eyelids and a slow pulse in the morning. Shoes remain by the door. The silence stretches. No one says anything. That is how it slips. When he returns, it feels like starting over. Muscles protest. Breath burns early. Fingers feel clumsy on familiar tools. A friend jokes that he fell off the wagon. Laughter lands where it always lands. He feels heat behind the eyes. The body remembers the gap. The mind looks for a reason. This is the quiet danger. Not failure, but the reset. Each interruption teaches the nervous system that discipline is temporary. The next time difficulty appears, the body pauses. The question returns. Just this once. Just today. The pulse quickens. Shoulders rise. Negotiation begins without witnesses. Watch him on a rainy morning. Water taps the window. The room smells stale. He stands there, towel in hand, deciding. Rain has become an argument. Weather has a vote. Later, he tells the story casually. No one challenges it. They rarely do. The body stores another exemption. In older places, this person would not be trusted yet. Not because he lacks effort, but because effort still leads. In a hall where mats are laid before dawn, no one asks how you feel. Knees fold onto the mat the same way every time. Breath finds its count. Hands repeat the grip. The room is cold. The routine continues. If you miss a day, the absence is noticed. Not announced. Not forgiven. Difficulty shows up there too. Sickness. Fatigue. Doubt. The response does not change. When the body cannot do much, it does little. When the mind resists, the breath counts louder. Consistency narrows but does not break. The chain stays unbroken. Others watch. They adjust their distance. This is where the shift begins. Not with intensity, but with predictability. The body starts moving before permission is granted. The schedule stops asking. Difficulty loses its leverage because it no longer interrupts anything. It is simply part of the room. At that point, people speak to you differently. Invitations come with disclaimers. Jokes soften. Your presence introduces a quiet standard. You notice the weight of it in the shoulders, the steady pulse, the calm that follows repetition. The old habit of restarting feels foreign, almost irresponsible. And yet, the question remains, waiting for the next disruption, where mornings collapse without noise. This is where most days quietly unravel. Not with failure, but with discussion. The alarm sounds. The room is dim. Breath fogs slightly in the cold. The body knows what comes next. The mind arrives late and starts talking. Just today. Just this once. The shoulders tighten as if bracing for a debate. No one else hears it. He stands by the bed, feet numb against the floor, phone warm in his palm. The screen offers alternatives. Messages. News. Delay disguised as information. His pulse lifts. He scrolls. Somewhere across town, someone else is already moving. That thought lands and slips away. Negotiation continues because it has always been allowed. At training, the same thing happens under different lighting. The weight feels heavier than last week. The grip slips with sweat. A voice suggests adjusting the plan. Others rest between sets, watching. He mirrors them, even when his turn is not done. No one corrects him. Silence is permission. The body learns that stopping is acceptable when discomfort appears. This is not weakness. It is patterning. Each time the response to strain includes a choice, the nervous system memorizes the exit. The next time strain arrives, the body flinches earlier. Breath shortens sooner. Muscles brace before effort begins. Difficulty gains a head start. In places built on repetition, this conversation never forms. When rain falls, training moves indoors. When exhaustion appears, intensity drops but attendance remains. When the schedule breaks, the next available slot is taken without comment. Knees fold onto the mat. Hands wrap the handle. Breath counts return when the mind resists. The room smells of wood and old fabric. Others notice if you are late. They do not ask why. Social friction sharpens the edge. Friends begin to hesitate before suggesting changes. Invitations come with apologies attached. Someone jokes that you are rigid. The joke lands because it's true. Your routine has stopped accommodating their comfort. The body feels the steadiness of it, a pulse that no longer spikes at obstacles. The internal war does not end. It becomes brief. A flicker. The body moves while the mind is still assembling its case. Shoes are on. The door closes. Cold air hits the lungs. The argument arrives too late to matter. That is when difficulty starts losing its voice. Not because it disappears, but because it no longer interrupts anything. The response has been decided long before the moment arrives. And yet, one question still lingers, waiting for the next unexpected break, when choice becomes the hidden enemy. Choice feels harmless at first. Even generous. He tells himself it's flexibility. Adaptation. Intelligence. The body doesn't argue. It simply waits. Shoes stay by the wall. The belt hangs loose. The room is quiet except for the hum of electricity. Outside, the morning moves without him. No one knocks. The problem with choice is not that it leads to the wrong decision. It is that it forces a decision at all. Each time difficulty appears, the body is asked to vote. The shoulders tense. Breath shifts higher in the chest. The pulse lifts before movement begins. Effort is spent before effort even starts. This is where fatigue is born. Watch him on a day that goes wrong early. A meeting runs long. Food is late. The jaw tightens. By evening, the plan feels fragile. Training becomes conditional. He stands in the doorway, bag in hand, heat behind the eyes, calculating. Someone texts. "We're grabbing a drink." The pause stretches. He chooses. The body records the outcome. In places where discipline holds, choice is treated with suspicion. Not because it is evil, but because it is expensive. Time is fixed. Action is fixed. Weather does not renegotiate. Mood does not intervene. When rain falls, feet still move. When the body is heavy, the pace slows but the door still closes behind you. There is no discussion to remember later. This is not rigidity. It is conservation. The nervous system relaxes when it knows what comes next. Breath settles sooner. Movements become economical. Hands wrap the handle the same way. Knees fold onto the mat without ceremony. The floor is cold, you kneel anyway. Others arrive on time because lateness would be visible. Social pressure sharpens this further. When everyone moves the same way, deviation becomes loud. Not punished. Seen. A late arrival draws glances. A skipped session is felt in the room. No explanation is demanded. The silence is enough. The body feels it in the gut, a quiet tightening that corrects behavior faster than words. Over time, something subtle shifts. Difficulty still appears, but it arrives to a system already in motion. There is no opening to negotiate. The response has been rehearsed so often that it fires on contact. Cold air fills the lungs. The pulse steadies. The mind catches up halfway through the first repetition. This is where people begin to misread you. They say you're intense, predictable, hard to schedule. The comments carry a hint of distance. You feel it when conversations end sooner, when plans are made without consulting you. The body registers the cost. Tightness in the shoulders. A familiar ache in the legs. You continue anyway. Because the alternative is returning to choice. And choice has already shown what it takes from you. The next disruption is coming. It always is. The only question left is whether it will find an opening. Continuity holds when strength does not. There is a day when strength is unavailable. Sleep was shallow. The body wakes heavy, joints stiff, mouth dry. The mirror shows a face that looks negotiated already. This is where most routines disappear quietly. Not announced. Just postponed. The body notices the delay like a skipped heartbeat. He shows up anyway. Not fully. Not impressively. The door closes behind him with less force than usual. The room feels colder than yesterday. Fingers ache as they wrap familiar tools. Breath is shallow, then counted. Others are there, moving at their own pace. No one comments on the reduction. They notice that he arrived. This is where continuity earns its place. When effort cannot be high, it narrows. When speed is gone, precision remains. A single repetition. A shortened session. Knees fold onto the mat for a minute instead of an hour. The floor is still cold. The body still kneels. The chain does not break. Contrast this with the days he used to disappear. One missed session became two. Two became a story. I'll restart properly next week. The body learned that absence was allowed when conditions were imperfect. Each restart felt heavier than the last. Muscles resisted. Breath burned early. Shame arrived with heat behind the eyes. Others sensed it and softened their expectations. Here, no restart is needed. There was no stop. The nervous system stays oriented. The pulse steadies faster. The body trusts the pattern even when capacity drops. Difficulty loses its favorite weapon, which is interruption. Social friction shifts again. People expect you to be there, even diminished. When you're not, the absence is louder than before. A glance. A pause. Nothing is said. The message lands in the shoulders, a familiar weight that pulls you back the next time without argument. This is not heroism. No one applauds reduced effort. It is quieter than that. Almost boring. Repetition without drama. Hands wrap the handle the same way. Breath counts return when the mind wanders. The room smells of sweat and old wood. Time passes without ceremony. Over weeks, something subtle changes. The fear of bad days fades. You no longer need conditions to align. Rain, fatigue, minor illness, they no longer threaten the chain. The response has been conditioned: show up, adjust, continue. The body begins moving before the mind checks the weather. Others notice the absence of swings. You do not surge, then vanish. You remain. Invitation shifts tone. I know you probably won't, they say, half smiling. You feel the distance. It costs something. Tightness in the chest. A quiet loneliness after sessions. You accept it. Because continuity has replaced intensity as the standard. And once that standard is set, difficulty has very little left to negotiate with. The next obstacle will test this differently. The answer is decided before the problem. Difficulty becomes dangerous when it forces thought. The moment something unexpected happens, most people stop moving. The body tightens. Breath lifts. The eyes search for options. This pause feels intelligent. It feels responsible. It is where the break usually begins. Watch him when the plan fractures midday. A call cancels the session. Traffic thickens. The bag stays in the car. He sits behind the wheel, fingers stiff on the steering wheel, jaw locked. The question forms automatically. What now? The longer it lingers, the heavier the body feels. By the time he decides, the decision has already drained him. In places shaped by repetition, this moment never opens. Responses are set in advance. When the hall is closed, training moves to the corridor. When time collapses, the session compresses. When the body is exhausted, the pace drops but the action remains. The rule is simple, the chain continues. The body recognizes the rule before the mind arrives. You can feel it in the shift. There is no spike of tension when plans change. Breath stays low. The shoulders do not rise. The feet start moving toward the nearest available space. Hands wrap the handle. Knees find the mat. The environment adjusts around you, not the other way around. Others notice this speed. Not speed of movement, but speed of response. While they are still discussing alternatives, you are already halfway through the adjusted work. It creates friction. Someone laughs and says you are extreme. Another rolls their eyes. The room rearranges socially. You feel it in the tightening across the chest, the slight isolation that follows. This is the cost of pre-decided responses. You no longer participate in the collective pause. You don't share the ritual of complaint. When rain starts, you move indoors without comment. When equipment is missing, you substitute without asking. The silence can feel sharp. The body absorbs it anyway. Over time, difficulty loses its timing advantage. It arrives, but the response is already in motion. There is no window for doubt to widen. Cold air hits the lungs. Muscles warm gradually. The pulse steadies. The mind catches up late and finds the work already underway. The old habit of problem-solving fades. Not because problems disappear, but because they no longer require deliberation. When X happens, Y follows. The sequence is etched into the body through repetition, not will. People begin to predict you. He'll still go. She'll adjust. The predictability unsettles them. It removes excuses they rely on. Some distance themselves. Others test you, waiting for inconsistency. You feel their attention like weight across the shoulders. You continue. Because the answer was decided long before the problem arrived. The next stage is quieter, and more visible than expected. The body moves before permission is given. There comes a point when the body no longer waits. The alarm sounds and the movement begins before thought finishes forming. Feet find the floor. The air is cold in the lungs. Fingers feel thick, uncooperative. None of it matters. The sequence has already started. This is not enthusiasm. It is familiarity. The body recognizes the pattern the way it recognizes gravity. When resistance appears, it does not escalate into drama. The shoulders tighten briefly, then settle. Breath counts itself. The door closes. Outside, someone notices and looks away, unsure why you did not hesitate. At training, this shows up quietly. While others stretch and talk, you begin. Not faster. Earlier. Hands wrap the handle the same way. Knees fold onto the mat without ceremony. The floor is cold, you kneel anyway. A glance from the corner of the room registers this. No comment follows. Social space adjusts. The mind still speaks. It always will. But its timing is off now. By the time it offers alternatives, the work is underway. Muscles warm. Pulse steadies. Sweat forms along the spine. The argument arrives late and leaves early. The body has learned that motion resolves doubt more efficiently than discussion. This shift creates distance. Friends notice you don't linger in the decision phase anymore. You don't join the group pause before starting. Someone jokes that you are robotic. Another says nothing and watches. Invitations change shape. If you're free, they add, already assuming the answer. You feel the pressure across the chest. You accept it. The cost is subtle. There are fewer shared excuses. Fewer moments of collective hesitation. You are present, but slightly apart. The body feels it after sessions, a quiet loneliness that sits behind the sternum. You don't chase it away. You've learned not to negotiate with sensations either. Difficulty still appears, but now it meets momentum. Fatigue shows up mid-action, not before. Weather interrupts, not prevents. Obstacles become adjustments rather than stops. The response is physical before it is mental. The system carries you through moments that used to derail you. Others test this unconsciously. They wait for you to slip, to complain, to ask for leniency. When it doesn't happen, they recalibrate their expectations or their proximity. You notice the shift in tone, the slight formality that replaces familiarity. The body tightens, then releases. You continue. Because once the body learns to move without permission, difficulty loses its favorite leverage. The final change is not internal. It is reflected back at you, when others feel the weight of your order. The change becomes visible before it is discussed. People begin to measure their words around you. Not out of fear, but out of recalibration. Your schedule no longer flexes to absorb theirs. Your presence carries a quiet firmness that alters the room. You feel it when conversations pause as you enter, when someone checks the time and adjusts their posture. At gatherings, this is clearest. Plates clatter. Voices overlap. Someone suggests an early start tomorrow. The room groans softly. You say nothing. Your hands rest on the table, fingers still, shoulders relaxed. Cold air brushes your forearms from an open window. The suggestion dies without argument. Later, a friend pulls you aside and says you make things feel serious. You nod. The body absorbs the label without heat. This is not arrogance. It is consequence. Your routine has stopped negotiating, and that exposes how often others do. Some feel challenged. Others feel relieved. A few drift away. You notice the absence like a change in pressure. The chest tightens briefly. Breath settles. You keep your time. At training, newcomers watch you first. Not because you are the strongest, but because you are predictable. You arrive when expected. You leave when finished. You do not explain adjustments. When difficulty appears, you respond without spectacle. Hands wrap the handle. Knees fold onto the mat. The floor is cold, you kneel anyway. They copy this without being told. Difficulty still visits you. It always will. Fatigue dulls the limbs. Doubt flickers late at night. Weather presses against the lungs. But none of it asks who you are anymore. The response has been conditioned through repetition, not resolve. The body answers before the question fully forms. There is a quiet cost to this stability. You are less available for last-minute chaos. Less tolerant of shared hesitation. Some bonds loosen. Others deepen unexpectedly. The ones that remain feel heavier, more deliberate. You carry that weight in the legs, the steady pulse, the familiar ache that follows honest repetition. This is where discipline stops being visible as effort and starts being felt as gravity. Difficulty orbits it. People adjust their paths around it. You no longer prepare for resistance. You meet it the way you meet the floor every morning, without ceremony. The work has not ended. It has simply removed its disguise. Discipline settles into the body. At some point, the struggle disappears without announcement. Not because difficulty leaves, but because it no longer defines the moment. The body knows what comes next. The breath settles sooner. The shoulders drop before tension finishes rising. You move, and only afterward realize you could have hesitated. This is where discipline reveals its true shape. It is no longer something you apply when things are hard. It is something you carry into the room. Difficulty meets it the way water meets stone, present, persistent, and already accounted for. There is no surge of pride in this. No sense of conquest. Just a quiet reliability that holds when nothing else does. You feel the shift most clearly in ordinary moments. Shoes by the door that never move. Hands tying the same knot without thought. Knees folding onto the mat while the floor is still cold. Others notice before you do. They stop asking if you will show up. They start planning around the fact that you will. The body absorbs the weight of that expectation and stands under it. Discipline, at this point, is no longer a behavior. It is an identity. You are not someone who prepares for difficulty. You are someone whose response has already been conditioned. The question never finishes forming. The answer is already in motion. This is where the negotiation ends. Comment one action you will perform regardless of difficulty. One sentence. No explanation,